for you. And so a lot of, and this is something to think about too, we'll try to get into this in some depth in the class, a lot of what you need to do to make your life at least tolerable is to figure out what your personality attributes are, and then to find a niche where they're valued. So for example, for those of you that are creative, you probably know who you are, it's actually a rare trait, by the way, I wouldn't recommend banking or law, because law and banking, just to take two examples, are very conservative enterprises. We tested the 100 most creative lawyers in Canada at one point with, they were nominated by their firms, and the most outstanding personality attribute of the 100 most creative lawyers was not openness, it wasn't creativity, it was conscientiousness, even though they were the 100 most creative lawyers. And of course law depends on precedent. I mean, how creative do you want your lawyer to be? You know, if your lawyer's creative enough, then you'll be in jail, so that's probably not, you know, it's not the greatest idea. So it's very useful to get a handle on what your personality is, because then you can take a look at the potential environments that lie in front of you and hopefully match yourself to one of them. Now that's a tricky business, you know, because it isn't necessarily the case that the niche that you're most suitable to inhabit is one that's stable or economically viable, you know. So for example, I think in some ways it's become more difficult, for example, to monetize a variety of different creative productions. So it's harder to monetize music, for example, because of course it can be shared for nothing. So, you know, it's luck of the draw to some degree. So now the other part of the course is the transformation element. Now, you know, personality is stable, so if you test a person at one time and you test a person later, then there's high correlations between the two sets of tests, but there's also variability. And the variability is the part that contains the potential, so to speak, for transformation. So you're an entity with quasi-fixed attributes, but that doesn't mean that you can't transform and learn. You know, you're sort of this weird balance between stability and plasticity, which actually happen to be two meta traits of personality. And I also want to take you through the process of understanding what personality transformation is and how to conceptualize it, because personality transformation comes at a cost, and the cost seems to be, with each incremental change there is an equal increment of instability, you know. So that's often because you learn things painfully, right? I mean, if you learn something, if it's something you expect and something you want, there's no learning there, generally speaking, because you expect it, so it means you already know about it, and you want it, so it's good. The most potent learning experiences tend to occur when something occurs within the realm of your experience that you don't expect, and often that you don't want. And those are the sorts of things that destabilize your personality. Now, they can also be the sort of things that eventually expand it, because if you encounter something that you don't understand, that means that there's information in the event that you haven't incorporated within your own being. And if you can do that, then at least in principle, then your dominion of competence can expand. Now, one of the things, you see, the course is sort of broken up, roughly speaking, it's broken up into two sections. There are more sections which I'll get into, but the biggest split is actually between the clinical theorists. So those would be people who are, some of them are psychiatrists, most of them were practitioners, so their theories were derived from observations mostly of personality pathology and transformation. The first half of the course is really about that, and that's partly because I think the most intellectually compelling and perhaps even practically useful theories of personality have in fact been derived by clinical practitioners like Freud and like Jung and like Rogers and of the various people that we're going to talk about. And one of the things that's really interesting about the clinical practitioners, because they have to deal with issues of health, roughly speaking, good mental health versus poor mental health, say, is that their fields of endeavor also deal with values, because it's almost impossible to grapple with the problem of the good or well-being or mental health or psychopathology or suffering or anxiety or pain or any of those phenomena without also necessarily evaluating the domain of values. It's like, okay, well, you're a certain way, do you want to be better? If you were better, would that mean that you were more mentally healthy? What exactly does better mean, and is it useful to use that sort of descriptive terminology when you're talking about personality? I mean, I assume that most of you want to be better people. Now, your definition of what might constitute better is going to differ again according to your temperament, but generally speaking, it seems that people are, they're like Sisyphus, they're uphill climbers. You know, you don't want to go from bad to worse, you want to go from where you are to better, and that means that you have to conceptualize what constitutes better, and that makes personality theory, at least in regard to its clinical domain, a very strange hybrid of science and engineering, because, you know, generally science doesn't deal with values, but if you're dealing with human personality, it seems impossible to avoid the topic, especially if you're concerned with something like mental health. So, you know, you can assume that mental health means normal, but most of you don't assume that, right? Because, you know, if you want your reach to exceed your grasp, a lot of you are going to be aiming for something that's better than normal, or better than average, let's say. We don't consider average optimal, and that's a strange thing. So, the first half of the course that deals with the clinicians is going to take us into the realm of personality transformation, and also necessarily lead us through a discussion of value, because I can't see that there's any avoiding it. Also, I think it would be ridiculous to